let's now move on to Porter's 5 forces. We've discussed, we've already discussed this pestle analysis, and we've also discussed the exam focus, the way you have to deal with this particular topic in the exam. Whenever you see the word macro environment analysis, that's a hint, that's a clear hint that you need to use pestle. Now we'll be discussing Porter's 5 forces framework. Now this Porter's 5 forces framework is basically used to analyze the competitive environment. It's used to analyze the competitive environment of an industry, right? So competitive environment of an industry is analyzed using the Porter's 5 forces framework. It is also known as marketplace analysis or industry analysis. So whenever you see these words in an examination requirement and a question requirement, make sure you make use of Porter's 5 forces. Again, I would say not all, you will not find all the 5 forces necessarily in the examination question, but you may find some of the forces, and you need to evaluate how those forces increase competition or reduce competition. Now, why is this framework very helpful? Because this framework helps to determine profit potential of an industry. This framework helps to determine the profit potential of an industry. The greater the degree of competition, the lesser would be the profits. The lesser the competition, the higher would be the profits. So it is used to determine the profit potential of an industry. And when is this framework used? This framework is used in 2 scenarios. The first scenario is when a company is thinking of entering an industry, when a company is already in that industry. So in both scenarios, this framework is used, because when you're thinking of entering in an industry, you need to see if that industry has got profit potential, because otherwise maybe you would be wasting on shareholders' money. So it is important that you need to analyze whether the industry offers good profit potential or not. And when you're already in that industry, then you need to understand the dynamics of competition and the behavior of competitors, so that you're able to respond to the risks or the threats or the opportunities that emanate from the competitive environment. So pestle is used for macro environment analysis. Porter's 5 forces is used for competitive environment analysis. Now, as the name suggests, it says Porter's 5 forces. So who's Porter? Basically, Michael Porter is an American management writer, and he has summarized these forces or sources of competition in these. These are the 5 forces or sources of competition: threat from new entrants, bargaining power of buyers, bargaining power of suppliers, threat from substitute products, extent of competitive rivalry. This is again another very, very interesting framework. So let's start with the first force, that is the threat from new entrants. Okay, so in the threat from new entrants, you see, this is a problem, basically threat from new entrants. What do we mean by threat from new entrants? Just imagine an industry, and in an industry, if it is very easy to enter in an industry, then naturally the degree of competition would be very high in that industry, and the profit potential of that industry would obviously be low then, if it's very easy to enter in the industry. So you need to see how easy or how difficult is it to enter in an industry, because if it's very easy to enter in an industry, then the number of competitors would keep on increasing and profit margins would keep on shrinking. So we need to understand whether the threat of new entrant is low or high. Now, basically, that is determined by the barriers to entry. That's determined by the barriers to entry. Say that comes from the barriers to entry. So when it comes to those barriers, what are the key barriers to entry? They're basically the capital cost of entry. Capital cost of entry. If a huge capital is required, for example, if you want to set up a telecommunication business, for example, if you want to set up a chemical business, that requires a lot of capital. A lot of capital is required to start that business. If you want to start a pharmaceutical business, that requires a huge amount of capital, because then there will be a lot of research and development involved. So in such businesses, the threat of new entrants is low. It is difficult. Automobile business, threat of new entrants is low because it requires a lot of initial capital to enter. The other important factor that creates a barrier to entry is economies of scale. By saying that that's a foreign brand, that's not a local brand, so you should not be actually purchasing from that particular customer. Similarly, legislation, for example, where there are patent protections or there are long-term agreements, that also restricts the access to distribution channels. So all of these are scenarios where it would be difficult for new entrants to enter, because there have been long-term contracts and either the law or the long-term agreements are preventing the new competitors or the new entrants to enter the industry. Then the bargaining power of buyers, that's another force which you need to understand, the bargaining power of buyers. When it comes to the bargaining power of buyers, you need to know that where there are few buyers, they are in dictating terms and they're going to tell you at what price you're going to sell your product. So they're on dictating terms, they can exert pressure on you. And when they have a lot of alternative sources available, there are a lot of other sources available and products are largely undifferentiated, switching costs are low, then the bargaining power of buyers is very high. But if you're selling a product that is very unique, that has got a lot of unique selling points and the customers love it, then maybe the bargaining power of buyers would be very low. Contrary to this, a replica of this is the bargaining power of suppliers. Again, if there are few suppliers, their power would be very high, because they know that you have no other option but to buy from them. And switching costs are, if the switching costs are also considered to be high. The threat from substitute products. Now, this is a technical concept which you need to understand. When it comes to substitutes, you need to understand that we are when we talk about substitute in generic terms, that has a specific meaning. But now that we're studying Porter's 5 forces, Porter has assigned a specific meaning to substitute. By substitute product, what Porter means is that anything that meets the same requirement, that addresses the same need as the product which you are producing or the industry in which you are operating. I would give you a simple example to which all of us can relate. You see, in the past, people were traveling for business purposes, for business needs. But now, very frequently, you would see the use of video conferencing facilities. Offices are using video conferencing facilities. So video conferencing equipment manufacturers have offered a substitute to foreign travel, to business travel. So although they are two completely different industries, we're talking about airline, air travel is one industry, video conferencing equipment manufacturers is an altogether different industry. But because they're fulfilling the same need, the substitute products. So when we're talking about substitute products, please keep in mind that the products are supposed to be in different industries or from different segments, and they're fulfilling the same need. Some decades back, mobile phone and camera, they weren't seen as substitutes. But now mobile phones have got excellent cameras. So they've started acting as substitutes. This is the phenomenon which is termed as industry convergence. This phenomenon is termed as industry convergence. Okay, then we have competitive rivalry. Now, competitive rivalry is about the degree of competition amongst the existing competitors, right? The degree of competition amongst the existing competitors. And that depends on the number of competitors. The number of competitors means the more the competitors, the greater will be the rivalry amongst them. Degree of concentration. Degree of concentration means if there are few competitors that have a control over a substantial proportion of the market, then again there's going to be a lot of competition, because those few competitors would want to accomplish that market leadership status, and so there would be very cutthroat hyper competition between those companies. Rate of growth of the industry. This is a very important point that you need to keep in mind. When it comes to rate of growth in the industry, please keep in mind that if the industry revenues are declining, then competitive rivalry would be very high, because it means pie is shrinking, number of customers are shrinking, number of buyers are shrinking. So now remember, from an examination perspective, it is not that the examiner would tell you industry is declining and so you would say competitive rivalry is high because industry is declining. They would give you numbers. They would give you industry revenue for the last 3 years, and you would yourself have to calculate the percentage decrease in the industry revenues, and from that number, from that percentage, you will conclude that okay, fine, based on this analysis it shows that rate of growth of the industry is negative or is low, and so competitive rivalry would be very high. And margins, resultantly, what would happen? Margins would shrink, because you would have to compromise on price. For example, in certain countries, the price of telecommunication services has substantially declined because of the high degree of competition. Prices have kept on going down. Cost structures. If cost structures are high, fixed costs are high, to generate volume, if cost structures are high, then again the rivalry would be very high. Exit costs. Now if exit costs are high, what are exit costs? That if you leave the industry, all your equipment, everything that you have, because that's so specialized, you cannot put it to use elsewhere, so that will all be sunk cost. So sunk cost is high, exit cost is high. So if firms accept that okay, fine, we're ready to operate on low margins because exit costs are too high, so if the firms choose this option of staying despite low margins, then the number of firms or the number of companies in the industry would remain high, number of competitors would remain high, and so the degree of competition, the intensity of competition would be high too. So that's the key to it. Okay, now there's a past exam related example. That's not strictly speaking strategic business leader example, but that's a good way of developing the skill of applying it to a mini scenario. And let's first go through the requirement. Identify any additional internal, external information which you need before you could set about writing your report, and indicate how you would gather such information. Internal and external information. So internal information, capabilities, resources, competences; external information, macro environment, competitive environment. So you would be talking about internal information, internal factors, and you would be talking about external information or the external factors. So these notes would be made available to you, and you would have to, what you need to do is, as an assignment, you would be going through this exam related question, and then we would be discussing it in our next class that is scheduled on next Saturday. So you have 5 days to do this question, which is ample time, I believe. So you should invest some time on this. Also revise these notes so that you can be well versed with these concepts that we've studied.